I'm Grace, 36 female. I live in a city that never sleeps, in an apartment that I designed myself, a small sanctuary of clean lines and quiet ambition amidst the chaos. I'm a senior architect at one of the top firms in the country, a position I've sacrificed sleep, weekends, and a significant portion of my 20s and 30s to achieve. This story is about the moment I finally reached the summit of a mountain I'd been climbing for over a decade, only to find that the people who were supposed to be my biggest cheerleaders didn't even bother to look up. It's about how their silence revealed a lie that had shaped my entire life. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a day thick with the smell of rain and the hum of fluorescent lights. The subject line was deceptively simple: an announcement. My heart, which had been methodically beating to the rhythm of drafting software clicks, suddenly felt like a trapped bird. For 3 weeks, the firm had been deliberating, interviewing the 3 final candidates for the senior architect position left vacant by a retiring legend. I was one of them. I'd poured everything I had into the final presentation, a comprehensive, multi-phase plan for the city's new waterfront revitalization project. It was the most challenging, ambitious work of my career. My finger hovered over the mouse, a tremor running through my hand. I clicked. The first line was all I needed to see. It is with great pleasure that we announce the promotion of Grace Adler to senior architect. I didn't read the rest. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather groaning in protest, and stared at the ceiling. I had done it. 14 years of grueling hours, of being the first one in and the last one out, of sacrificing personal milestones for professional ones. It had all culminated in this single, beautiful moment of validation. My colleagues flooded my desk with congratulations, handshakes, and pats on the back. The air buzzed with genuine excitement, and for a few hours, I felt like I was floating. That evening, I wanted to share the news with the people who, in theory, should have been the proudest. My family. We had a weekly group chat titled Adler Updates, a space usually dominated by my younger brother, Mark. I opened the app, my thumbs still feeling slightly shaky. "Some incredible news," I typed, my smile so wide it made my cheeks ache. "I got the promotion. I'm officially a senior architect at the firm." I added a string of champagne bottle emojis and hit send, imagining the flurry of excited responses. I pictured my mom, Helen, calling me immediately, her voice filled with the rare but powerful pride she reserved for significant achievements. I imagined Mark, despite our competitive history, sending a "congrats, sis" text. The first response came 10 minutes later. It was from my mother. My heart leaped. I tapped on the notification. It was a photo. Not of me, not of a celebratory cake, but of my brother Mark and his new girlfriend, Jessica. They were at some impossibly chic rooftop bar, laughing, their heads closed together. Jessica was stunning, a willowy brunette with an effortless style that made her look like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. The caption my mother had written underneath was simple: "Mark and Jessica at the new gallery opening. Doesn't she just look so happy?" I stared at the screen, baffled. My news, the biggest professional accomplishment of my life, was sitting right above her message, completely unacknowledged. Maybe she hadn't seen it, maybe the app glitched, but then my aunt replied to my mother's photo. "Gorgeous couple, she has a wonderful smile." Then my cousin, "They look amazing." The conversation snowballed, a cascade of compliments for Mark and Jessica. How beautiful they were, how perfect for each other, how happy Jessica looked. Not a single person mentioned my promotion. My message, with its cheerful emojis and exclamation points, was an island of professional triumph in a sea of vapid pleasantries, completely ignored. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach. This wasn't an oversight. This was a statement. I'd spent my life in Mark's shadow. He was the golden child, the investment banker who made a fortune seemingly overnight. His successes were loud, flashy, and easily understood. A new sports car, a lavish vacation, a beautiful girlfriend. My success was quiet, methodical, and built over years of painstaking work. It was measured in blueprints and building codes, in structures that would stand long after we were all gone. It wasn't as photogenic. But I thought, naively, it turned out, that this achievement, this title, would be big enough to finally command their attention, big enough to be seen. I closed the group chat, the screen going dark on Jessica's smiling face. The celebratory buzz I'd been riding all afternoon vanished, replaced by a hollow ache. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my apartment, the city lights twinkling below like 1,000 indifferent stars. I had built a life for myself, a career I was immensely proud of. I had designed buildings that touched the sky. Yet, in the eyes of my own family, I was invisible. The silence from the Adler updates, chat was louder than any insult they could have hurled. It wasn't anger or jealousy I was sensing from them, it was something far more devastating. It was apathy. My greatest victory was, to them, nothing more than a minor event, easily overshadowed by a pretty picture of the son they truly valued and the woman who adorned his arm. That night, I didn't celebrate. I just stood by the window, watching the city live and breathe, feeling utterly and completely alone. The triumph felt hollow, a tree falling in a forest with no one around to hear it. The weight of their indifference was crushing, a silent, brutal confirmation of what I had suspected for years. In the grand narrative of the Adler family, I was merely a supporting character. The following Sunday was our mandatory family dinner. It was a tradition my mother, Helen, had instituted years ago, a non-negotiable event held at her immaculately decorated home. In the past, I'd found them tolerable, sometimes even pleasant. But walking up the stone path to her front door this time, I felt a sense of dread. The silence in the group chat had continued for days. Not a single person had circled back to congratulate me. The digital void had been filled with more photos of Mark and Jessica, their weekend getaway, their brunch, their seemingly perfect life. I had become a ghost in my own family's conversation. I steeled myself, took a deep breath, and walked inside. The scene in the living room was exactly as I'd pictured. Mark was holding court by the fireplace, a glass of expensive scotch in hand, telling some exaggerated story about a deal he'd closed. Jessica was perched on the arm of his chair, laughing at all the right moments, a picture of rapt adoration. My mother was watching them, her expression a mixture of pride and reverence. She, a retired surgeon who had held lives in her hands, looked at her banker son and his curator girlfriend as if they were royalty. When she finally noticed me standing in the doorway, her smile didn't widen. It just shifted. "Grace, you're here. Put your coat in the closet." There was no hug, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of the monumental shift in my career. I did as I was told, the knot in my stomach tightening. Throughout the evening, I tried to steer the conversation toward my work. When my father asked how my week was, I said it was actually the biggest week of my career. The promotion came through. He nodded vaguely. "Oh, that's nice, dear," he said, before turning his attention back to Mark. "So, Mark, tell me more about this commercial property downtown." It was a brick wall. Every attempt I made to share my joy was met with a polite but firm redirection back to the golden couple. The conversation revolved around 3 topics: Mark's latest financial conquest, Jessica's upcoming gallery exhibition, and their plans to buy a summer home in the Hamptons. My promotion, the culmination of a decade and a half of relentless effort, was treated like a footnote, a piece of trivia not interesting enough to warrant discussion. The most painful moment came during dinner. My mother, raising her glass of wine, said, "I'd like to make a toast." For a wild, hopeful second, I thought, this is it. She waited to do it in person, but her eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on Jessica. "To Jessica," my mother announced, her voice resonating with warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "For bringing so much light and happiness into our family, we are so thrilled to have you." Everyone at the table raised their glasses. "To Jessica," they chorused. I watched, my own glass frozen halfway to my lips, as they all drank to the newcomer who had effortlessly captured the validation I had spent my entire life chasing. Jessica blushed demurely. "Thank you, Helen. You've all made me feel so welcome." Mark beamed, wrapping an arm around her. "She's one of us now," he declared. The implication was clear. She, a stranger of 6 months, was one of them. And I, the daughter, the sister who had been there for 36 years, was not. I felt a surge of something hot and bitter in my chest. It was a toxic cocktail of anger, humiliation, and profound sadness. I looked around the table at their smiling faces, their easy laughter, and I saw the truth with stark clarity. It wasn't that they didn't understand my achievement. My mother, the surgeon, knew what dedication was. My father, an NG. Near knew what it took to build something lasting. They understood. They just didn't care. My success didn't fit into the narrative they had constructed for their family, a narrative where Mark was the star and everyone else was just part of his orbit. I excused myself from the table, claiming a headache. I went to the guest bathroom and locked the door, leaning against the cold marble counter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror. My eyes were wide with a pain that felt ancient and deep-seated. This wasn't just about a promotion. It was about a lifetime of being second best, of being overlooked, of having my accomplishments minimized to make Mark's shine brighter. I had always been the quiet one, the studious one, while Mark was the charismatic one, the go-getter. I had thought that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, they would have no choice but to see me. I was wrong. My achievements were an inconvenience to them, a distraction from the main event, the life and times of Mark Adler. I splashed cold water on my face, took a few deep breaths, and composed myself. When I returned to the dining room, they were deep in conversation about floral arrangements for Jessica's gallery opening. No one had noticed I was gone. I sat down and picked at my food, a silent observer at my own family dinner. The laughter and chatter around me sounded distant, like a television playing in another room. I was there, but I wasn't. The shadow cast by Mark and Jessica was so long and so dark, it had swallowed me whole. I knew then that I couldn't keep fighting for a glimmer of light from people who were determined to keep me in the dark. The indifference wasn't passive, it was an active, crushing force, and it was breaking me. 2 weeks passed in a blur of architectural plans and forced smiles. I buried myself in my new role, the long hours a welcome anesthetic for the persistent ache in my chest. The Adler updates, chat remained a shrine to Mark and Jessica. I had muted it. The silence was better than the constant, painful reminders of my irrelevance. The family had made their priorities clear, and I was not one of them. I was in the process of a painful but necessary emotional withdrawal, building a fortress around a heart that felt bruised and exposed. Then, on a Thursday evening, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a spam call, but something made me answer. "Hello," I said, my voice flat with exhaustion. "Is this Grace Adler?" a man's voice asked. It was deep and resonant, with a warmth that felt unfamiliar. "Yes, this is she," I replied, shuffling through some blueprints on my coffee table. "Grace, you probably don't remember me, but my name is David Chen. I was a very close friend of your grandparents, particularly your grandfather, Richard." The name pricked at my memory. My grandfather Richard had passed away when I was very young. He was my mother's father, but Helen rarely spoke of him. The few photos I'd seen were of a stern-looking man with kind eyes, David Chen. I vaguely recalled my mother mentioning a journalist friend of her father's, someone she'd lost touch with years ago. "Mr. Chen," I said, surprised, "I think I've heard my mother mention you." "Please call me David," he said, "and I imagine she hasn't mentioned me in a long time. Helen and we had a falling out after your grandfather passed, but that's a story for another time. The reason I'm calling Grace is to say congratulations." I froze, the blueprint in my hand slipping from my grasp. "Congratulations?" "Yes," he chuckled. "I still keep tabs on the old crowd. I saw the announcement from your firm in an industry journal. Senior architect. That's a monumental achievement. Your grandfather would have been bursting with pride. He always believed a person's legacy was what they built with their own 2 hands." Tears pricked my eyes. To hear this from a stranger, this genuine, unprompted acknowledgement, was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. It was everything I had craved from my own family. "Thank you, David," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. That means a lot to me, more than you know." There was a pause on the line, and when he spoke again, his tone was more serious. Grace, that's the other reason I called. I imagine your family must have been thrilled. They must have thrown you a big party. The question was innocent, but it landed like a punch to the gut. I hesitated, the shame and hurt swirling inside me. I found myself confessing to this kind stranger on the phone. No, I said quietly. They didn't. In fact, they haven't mentioned it at all. They were more focused on my brother's new girlfriend. The words sounded so petty and pathetic when I said them out loud, but David didn't laugh. He was silent for a long moment. Ah, he said, a world of understanding in that single syllable. So, nothing has changed. What do you mean? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Your grandfather, Richard, was a brilliant man, David began, his voice taking on a narrative quality. A self-made man. He built a successful construction empire from nothing. But he was always worried about your mother, Helen. She was fixated on appearances, on status. After he passed, she and your father took control of the estate. And they did something I never agreed with. They restructured his legacy. A cold feeling began to creep up my spine. What did they do? Richard left behind a significant fortune, David explained. But more importantly, he left behind a mission. He set up a trust, a family foundation. The original charter, which I helped him draft, was explicit. The funds were to be used to support future generations of the family in endeavors of substance and creation. Things like education, starting a business from the ground up, achievements in the arts and sciences. Things you build. He wanted to reward hard work and tangible creation, not just existence. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. I had never heard of a family foundation. I don't understand, I said. I've never heard of this Cedarwood Trust. David sighed, a heavy, weary sound. That's because your parents altered the charter after Richard's death. They rewrote the bylaws. They shifted the focus from creation and achievement to something they called furthering the family name. In practice, that meant consolidating the family's wealth and influence around a single, chosen heir in each generation. An heir they believed was best suited to represent the family in high society. The blood drained from my face as the implication of his words crashed down on me. An heir, I whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. Mark. Exactly, David confirmed, his voice grim. They chose Mark when he was just a boy. They've been grooming him, funding him, propping him up his entire life with the resources from that trust. His overnight success in investment banking wasn't just talent, Grace. It was heavily subsidized by your grandfather's legacy. A legacy that was meant for all of you. I sank onto my sofa, the phone pressed hard against my ear. My entire life, my entire family dynamic was suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. My parents' preference for Mark wasn't just emotional, it was financial, it was strategic. My hard-won success, my promotion, wasn't just ignored because it was less flashy. It was ignored because, in their rewritten world, it didn't matter. I wasn't the chosen one. I was an afterthought, and my achievements were irrelevant to the grand plan. The profound indifference wasn't a personal failing on their part, it was a calculated policy. David's final words hung in the air, chilling me to the bone. Grace, he said softly, they didn't just ignore your success. They stole the inheritance that should have celebrated it. The phone call with David Chen shattered the world as I knew it. For the next few days, I was in a daze, his words replaying in my mind on a loop. They stole the inheritance that should have celebrated it. It was a betrayal so profound, so fundamental, that I could barely process it. My parents, the people who were supposed to support me, had not only emotionally sidelined me, but had also actively diverted a legacy that was rightfully mine. The indifference wasn't just a flaw in their character. It was the cornerstone of a decades-long deception. My grief quickly hardened into a cold, sharp resolve. I couldn't let this stand. This was no longer about wanting their approval, it was about reclaiming a part of my heritage that had been stolen in secret. I called David back. I need to prove it, I said, my voice devoid of the emotion that had choked me just days before. I need evidence, documents, anything. David, true to his journalistic roots, was ready. I thought you might say that, he replied. When your grandfather died, I was the executor of his will. I kept copies of the original trust documents, the ones he and I drafted together. I knew, even then, that your mother might try something. I'll scan them and send them to you. He also gave me a name, Leonard Finch, the lawyer who had handled the trust for years before retiring abruptly when my parents took over. David suspected Finch had been pushed out for objecting to the changes. Finding him was my next step. A quick search revealed that Leonard Finch was living in a quiet retirement community upstate. I took a day off work, something I rarely did, and drove the 2 hours through a landscape of autumn foliage, my mind a storm of strategy and anger. I found Mr. Finch tending to a small garden of roses. He was an elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When I introduced myself as Grace Adler, Richard's granddaughter, his expression shifted from placid retirement to cautious interest. I explained why. David Chen had told me, laying out the story of the altered trust. He listened patiently, his hands resting on his trowel. When I finished, he sighed deeply. I knew this day would come, he said, his voice raspy with age. I told your mother that what she was doing was a perversion of her father's wishes. He wanted to build a dynasty of creators, not a monarchy for a chosen prince. He invited me inside his small, tidy home. From a locked file cabinet, he retrieved a dusty, leather-bound ledger. Your parents were clever, he explained, opening it on the dining table. They didn't break the law, not technically. They exploited loopholes. The original charter was about funding endeavors. They argued that Mark's entire life and career was a single, ongoing endeavor to elevate the family's social standing. He showed me the amended bylaws. The language was vague but insidious, filled with phrases like consolidating family assets and furthering the Adler name. Then he turned a page in the ledger. It was a meticulous record of every disbursement from the Cedarwood Trust since my grandfather's death. I stared at the pages, my breath catching in my throat. The numbers were staggering. A 7-figure initial investment for Mark's first banking job, the full payment for his Ivy League MBA, a massive interest-free loan to start his own investment portfolio, which was later forgiven, the down payment for his luxury condo, his expensive cars, his club memberships, his tailored suits, all of it, every symbol of his effortless success, had been underwritten by the trust. My grandfather's money, my money. While I had been taking out student loans, living in tiny apartments, and working myself to the bone to climb the ladder on my own merit, my brother had been riding a golden elevator, funded by a secret I never knew existed. Mr. Finch pointed to a clause in the original charter that David had also sent me. This is the most important part, he said. Your grandfather called it the merit clause. It states that any direct descendant who achieves the highest level of accreditation or recognition in their chosen field, like becoming a partner, a senior associate, or, say, a senior architect, is entitled to a one-time legacy grant to establish their own contribution to the family's creative and structural heritage. The grant amount was specified, a sum equivalent to 25% of the trust's current value. My heart hammered against my ribs. They ignored it, I whispered, looking at the years of withdrawals for Mark and the complete absence of my name. Completely, Mr. Finch confirmed. According to the original, legally binding document, the moment you were promoted, you were entitled to that grant. By not informing you or dispersing the funds, they are in direct violation of the trust's primary directive. This is no longer a moral failing, Grace. This is a legal one. I drove back to the city with a fire in my veins. The evidence was irrefutable. The original charter from David, the amended bylaws and financial ledger from Mr. Finch, and the public announcement of my promotion. My parents hadn't just preferred Mark. They had systematically enriched him at my expense, violating the very core of my grandfather's will. Their indifference wasn't just hurtful. It was a strategy to keep me from claiming what was mine. They had hoped I would just stay quiet, work hard, and never ask any questions. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my quiet dedication for weakness. Now I had the truth, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. The quiet, overlooked daughter was about to become the architect of their downfall. The plan formed in my mind with the cool precision of a structural design. A public confrontation would be messy and unsatisfying. A lawsuit would be long, drawn out, and would allow them to control the narrative, painting me as a greedy, disgruntled daughter. No, the justice I sought had to be as calculated and deliberate as their deception had been. I needed to hit them where it hurt the most: their reputation, their carefully curated image, and the very foundation of the golden child they had built. My weapon would not be anger, but the cold, hard facts of the Cedarwood Trust. My stage would be an event of their own making. For weeks, my mother had been talking about the annual Adler family charity dinner. It wasn't really a charity dinner. It was a thinly veiled social event where my parents showcased their success to a curated audience of friends, business associates, and distant relatives. This year, the unofficial guest of honor was, of course, Jessica. My mother was planning a grand, public welcome for her into the family. It was the perfect venue. All the key players would be there, basking in the glow of the life my grandfather's legacy had funded. My first step was to secure my legal position. With the documents from David and Mr. Finch, I met with a highly recommended estate lawyer, a woman named Ms. Albright with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless. She reviewed the files, her expression growing more intense with each page. "This is airtight, Ms. Adler," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "The merit clause is unambiguous. The moment your promotion was official, you were legally entitled to the legacy grant. Their failure to notify you and their continued sole funding of your brother constitutes a severe breach of fiduciary duty." She drafted a set of official letters. The first was a formal claim to the trustees of the Cedarwood Trust, my parents, demanding the immediate disbursement of my legacy grant. The second was a cease and desist, ordering them to halt all non-essential payments from the trust, specifically citing the funds being funneled to Mark. The third was a letter of intent to sue for damages and mismanagement if they failed to comply within 30 days. But I wasn't going to send them yet. These letters were the final move, the checkmate. The setup came next. I reached out to David Chen again. "David," I said, "you mentioned you still keep in touch with some of the old crowd. Do you know anyone on the board of the City Historical Society?" He confirmed that he did. "Perfect," I said, and I laid out the second part of my plan. 2 weeks before the charity dinner, an article appeared in a prominent city magazine's culture section. It was a beautifully written piece titled "The Builders," honoring a city's architectural heritage. The article celebrated the legacy of my grandfather, Richard, praising his contributions to the city's skyline. It then seamlessly transitioned to me, his granddaughter, following in his visionary footsteps, with my recent promotion to senior architect and my work on the waterfront revitalization project. The article, subtly guided by information I'd fed through David's contacts, mentioned my grandfather's belief in building a legacy of creation and my commitment to that same principle. It ended with a tantalizing note. "Grace Adler is currently finalizing plans for a new foundation dedicated to providing scholarships for underprivileged architecture students, a project she says is inspired by her grandfather's philanthropic spirit." I had just publicly declared my intention to do what the Cedarwood Trust was originally created for. I had seized the narrative. The article sent a ripple through my parents' social circle. Suddenly, I was not just Mark's sister. I was Grace Adler, the inheritor of Richard's visionary talent. I received calls and emails from people I hadn't heard from in years, all congratulating me. The pressure was mounting on my parents. How could they ignore the publicly celebrated success of a daughter who was so clearly honoring the family legacy? The final piece of the plan involved Mark himself. Using a small portion of my own savings, I hired a private investigator. I didn't want dirt, I wanted financial data. Specifically, I wanted a clear, third-party analysis of Mark's investment firm. The report came back a week before the dinner, and it was exactly what I suspected. Mark wasn't a financial genius. He was mediocre at best. His firm was heavily leveraged, and his impressive returns were largely the result of continuous, massive cash infusions from the trust. Without that secret funding, his business was barely solvent. He wasn't the golden goose. He was a black hole, endlessly consuming my grandfather's fortune. I now had proof that my parents' investment in him was not only unfair, but it was also a catastrophic business decision. With the legal documents drafted, the public narrative set, and the truth about Mark's success confirmed, I was ready. I RSVP'd to my mother's dinner invitation. She sounded surprised to hear from me, but pleased. "Oh, wonderful, Grace. Jessica is so looking forward to seeing you." I smiled. "I'm looking forward to it too," I said, my voice even and calm. "I have an announcement of my own to share with the family. It's about Grandpa Richard's legacy." The trap was set. The stage was ready. And the star of the show was about to find out that his spotlight was about to be permanently switched off. I arrived at the charity dinner, held at a lavish downtown restaurant my parents had rented out for the evening, feeling a strange sense of calm. I was no longer the overlooked daughter seeking approval. I was an architect executing a plan, every girder and support beam of my strategy meticulously placed. I wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress, a color that conveyed seriousness and power. I looked the part of a woman who had inherited her grandfather's vision. The room was filled with the low hum of polite society chatter. My mother, Helen, glided through the crowd, a queen in her court. When she saw me, she kissed the air beside my cheek. "Grace, you look lovely. Did you see the article? Such a nice little piece about your work." Her tone was dismissive, as if it were a quaint school newsletter feature. She had no idea that the article was the first shot in a war she didn't even know was being fought. I saw Mark and Jessica holding court near the bar, surrounded by admirers. He was telling a story, gesticulating wildly, while she gazed at him with manufactured adoration. He caught my eye and gave me a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement from the king to a minor member of his court. I just smiled back, a serene, knowing smile that seemed to momentarily confuse him. Dinner was served at a long, beautifully decorated table. I was seated, predictably, at the far end, away from the center of power where my parents, Mark and Jessica, sat. The meal was punctuated by small talk and fake laughter. Finally, as dessert was being served, my father stood up, tapping his glass for attention. "If I could have everyone's attention," he began. "Helen and I just want to say how wonderful it is to have you all here. This has been a remarkable year for our family, filled with so much joy. Most notably, the joy of welcoming the lovely Jessica into our lives." He beamed at her, and she blushed on cue. "We see in her and in Mark the bright future of the Adler name." This was my moment. As he was about to sit down, I stood up, a folder in my hand. "That's a wonderful sentiment, Dad," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the polite applause. "And I agree it's important to talk about the future of the Adler name, and its past." A ripple of surprise went through the room. All eyes were on me. My mother shot me a look of pure venom. "How dare you steal the spotlight?" But I ignored it. I looked directly at my parents. "Many of you knew my grandfather, Richard," I began. "You knew him as a builder, a visionary who believed in creating things of substance. The article recently published about my work was right. He inspired me. So much so that I've been doing a lot of research into the legacy he left behind." I saw a flicker of panic in my mother's eyes. Mark was frowning, looking annoyed. "I learned about the Cedarwood Trust," I continued, my voice resonating in the now silent room. "A foundation my grandfather created to reward tangible achievement and creation within his family." I opened the folder and took out a copy of the original charter. "I have here the original trust document, which states that funds are to support descendants in endeavors of substance and creation. It even contains a merit clause, entitling a descendant who reaches the pinnacle of their profession to a substantial legacy grant to start their own project. A grant, for instance, for a newly promoted senior architect." My parents' faces had gone pale. Mark looked utterly bewildered. "What are you talking about?" he blurted out. "That's not what the trust is for." "Oh," I replied, turning to him, "you're right. That's not what it's been used for. It's been used as your personal bank account." I then pulled out the ledger from Mr. Finch. "I also have the financial records. Records of every dollar paid for your tuition, your condo, your cars, and the continuous multi-million-dollar bailouts for your successful investment firm, a firm which, according to this independent analysis, I held up the pie's report, is so heavily leveraged it's on the verge of collapse without the trust's funding. Gasps rippled through the audience. Mark's face went from confused to crimson with rage and humiliation. Jessica was staring at him, her perfect smile gone, replaced by a look of dawning horror. I turned my attention back to my parents. "You didn't just ignore my success," I said, my voice now laced with the ice of a decade of suppressed pain. "You actively worked against it. You took my grandfather's legacy, a legacy meant to foster creators, and you twisted it to prop up a lie. You funneled every resource to one son, in violation of the legal charter of the trust, while leaving your daughter to fend for herself." I placed the final documents on the table, the legal notices from my lawyer. "This is a formal demand for my legacy grant, as stipulated by the original charter. This is a cease and desist on all funds being paid to Mark. And this is a notice of my intent to sue you for breach of fiduciary duty and gross mismanagement of the Cedarwood Trust. You have 30 days to comply." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle into the suffocating silence. "You wanted to talk about the future of the Adler name, Dad. Well, here it is. The legacy of substance will be restored. My foundation for architecture students will be funded as my grandfather intended. The era of the golden child is over." I looked at my family. My mother was shaking with rage, my father looked broken, and Mark was staring at his plate, utterly defeated. Jessica had subtly edged her chair away from him. I had done it. I had not just exposed their secret, I had dismantled the entire false reality they had built. I turned to the stunned audience. "My apologies for interrupting dessert," I said calmly. "Please enjoy the rest of your evening." Then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the smoldering ruins of their reputation behind me. The cool night air had never felt so clean. The aftermath of the dinner party was not a loud explosion, but a series of quiet, devastating collapses. My parents, faced with irrefutable legal documents and the public humiliation of having their decades-long deception exposed, had no choice but to comply. Within 2 weeks, Ms. Albright confirmed that the transfer had been made. The full 25% of the Cedarwood Trust's value, a sum that was life-altering, was now in my control. The cease and desist was also in effect, cutting off the flow of funds to Mark's firm. The fallout was swift and brutal. As predicted by the investigators' report, Mark's company, deprived of its secret life support, imploded within a month. He was forced to declare bankruptcy. His condo was sold to cover his debts, his sports car was repossessed, and his friends, who had flocked to his success, vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The golden child, stripped of his gold plating, was revealed to be nothing more than an ordinary man who had been handed a life he hadn't earned. The last I heard, he was living in a small rental apartment, trying to find a mid-level job in a field where his reputation was now tarnished. Jessica, the adoring girlfriend, left him almost immediately. Her love had been an investment in the Adler name and fortune, and when the stock plummeted, she cashed out. Her social climbing ambitions had no room for a bankrupt boyfriend. Their perfect, happy romance, so celebrated by my family, had been as hollow as Mark's success. My parents retreated from their social life, embarrassed and exposed. They tried to reach out to me once. My mother sent a long, rambling email that was a masterclass in non-apology. She wrote of the difficult decisions they had to make, how they always wanted what was best for the family, and how I couldn't possibly understand the pressure they were under. She never once said the words, "I'm sorry." She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was only sorry she got caught. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The family I had once craved acceptance from no longer existed, and I realized it had never really existed at all. It was a facade, and I was finally free of the obligation to pretend it was real. With my new resources, I made good on my public promise. I established the Richard Adler Foundation for Architectural Excellence. It was a lean, efficient, and impactful organization. We provided full scholarships and mentorship programs for talented students from low-income backgrounds. the kind of brilliant, hardworking kids who, like me, had only their ambition to rely on. The work was more fulfilling than any building I had ever designed. I was not just building structures of steel and glass anymore, I was building futures. I was restoring my grandfather's true legacy. David Chen joined the foundation's board, and his wisdom was an invaluable guide. Mr. Finch also served as an advisor until his health declined. They became the family I had chosen, bound by shared principles, not by a dysfunctional sense of obligation. One afternoon, about a year later, David and I were reviewing scholarship applications in my office, which overlooked the waterfront project I had designed. The park below was filled with families, the buildings I'd helped create gleaming in the sun. It was a tangible reminder of what I had accomplished on my own. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi Grace, it's Mark. I know it's been a while. I just wanted to say, you were right. About everything, I'm sorry." I stared at the message for a long time. It was the first genuine apology I had ever received from my family. It was small and late, but it was there. I didn't feel anger or triumph. I just felt a quiet sense of closure. I typed back a simple response. "Thank you, Mark, I wish you well." I didn't need to say anything more. My forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. It was the final step in letting go. I had reclaimed my inheritance, but more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. I was no longer Grace, the overlooked daughter. I was Grace Adler, a senior architect, a philanthropist, a woman who, like her grandfather, built things that were meant to last. And this new foundation, built on truth and merit, was the strongest one of all.